Welcome once again to Why Should We Care About the Indo-Pacific, brought to you with the help of our friends at Bauer Group Asia. We will tell you more about them in due course. I am Ray Powell, feeling healthy and hearty in California. He is Jim Caruso, and he is still recovering in Arizona. Jim, how are you feeling?
I'm getting there, but I am just so pleased not to be dealing with snow.
Well, the person who is in snow today is our guest, Randy Schriver. He is coming to us from the Washington, D.C. area. He is the chairman of the board of the Project 2049 Institute. We'll talk more about them later. He's also the vice chair of the U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission. And he is finally, and most importantly, sort of for the kickoff of this discussion, was formerly the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Indo-Pacific Affairs during the first Donald Trump administration. Randy, thank you for joining us, and I'd like to start you with our very first question, which is, why should we care about Donald Trump's Indo-Pacific policy?
Well, thank you, and thanks for having me on this podcast. I've enjoyed your show for the last couple of years, and really appreciate the opportunity to join you. Look, I think we care about the Trump's Indo-Pacific policy because the region itself is of utmost importance to us by almost any objective measure. The economic and trade relationships, the military and security environment, everything impacts our interests with great weight. I think that was reflected in the first term of the Trump administration. If you look at the strategic documents, the national security strategy, the national defense strategy, all the way down to our Indo-Pacific security strategy report that my office initiated, you'll find that we identify the region as the priority region, not a priority, but the priority. And that allowed us to really have this organizing principle around our regional goals when it came to all the other things the defense enterprise does with respect to posture, acquisition, and really mirrored across government given the national security strategy and the directives contained therein. So it's important, the region, it's important to understand where the Trump administration was in 1.0 version and where it may go. I would add that, the first Trump administration, a lot of people focused on the stronger rhetoric, calling China a strategic competitor, putting a fine point on certain aspects. But really, in a lot of ways, it was more evolutionary than revolutionary. And we all remember the Obama administration and the pivot to Asia, talking about 60% of our naval forces in the region, talking about a rebalance within the rebalance with greater emphasis on Southeast Asia. So even though the styles were quite different and the rhetoric different, I think it was a more of an evolutionary step, which recognized not only our important objectives and really interests in the region, but the increasing challenges to them, primarily through China. But now we're seeing China, Russia, North Korea in an axis that are combining to really create a number of complex challenges for us going forward.
So, Randy, when you were in government, you focused a lot on strengthening, broadening alliances in the Indo-Pacific, and that's been continued under the Biden administration. But frankly, I'm concerned with the recent decision of President Biden to declare the takeover of U.S. Steel by Nippon Steel as a national security threat. Again, when we were all in government, we were in Australia and D.C., and Donald Trump tried to impose tariffs on Australian steel exports, saying they were a national security threat. I think we all talked about how a good ally being called a national security threat was actually a threat to our security. Are you concerned that this decision by Biden's administration leads the way to more findings of national security threats from our allies?
Yeah, well, I disagree with the decision. I should say that out front. And I think there is a component of U.S. politics now that run across the political spectrum that is really defined by economic nationalism. And, adding this component of national security concerns as they relate to these various trade arrangements and longstanding trade relationships is a concern to me. And I think, if we look at what was done in the first Trump administration and we look more recently at what's been said during the campaign and now the transition, I expect we're going to see use of tariffs. We're going to see more 301 type investigations on national security grounds, and that'll just be part of the fabric of an overall foreign policy, national security approach that I think people will have to adjust to. And in some cases, those adjustments could be costly to us. There could be retaliatory efforts. There could be trade arrangements where we're excluded. There could be a number of steps that other countries will take that, as you said, Jim, really can come back and hurt us. So we'll see if in fact this is going to be a leading edge and a high profile part of the Trump administration approach to the world. And we'll see what the reaction to that will be if it is indeed that case. But I would prefer to see an alliance management approach that really values these partnerships, that really recognizes them as force multipliers when it comes to our national security, not detrimental to them. So we'll see how things work out. If you look at the team that President Trump is putting together, there are a lot of strong figures who care deeply about our alliances. And so much like the first term, there will be different voices within the administration. Institutions matter. Congress matters. So I think there will be a lot of weight behind trying to improve alliances and strengthen them rather than just the forces that might do things that would diminish them.
Well, when we're talking about, Randy, with alliances, there are a couple of trains of thought that go into how do you approach alliances with regard to contributions to the alliance itself, and then broadening out to what are the other factors like trade and other things. And one of the big sort of dichotomies tends to be, on one hand, you have people who really value assurance. We want to assure our allies that we're going to be there for the long term. Don't worry, you can trust us. You don't have to hedge toward China. On the other hand, you have people who are more confrontational and says, look, we need to get these people to step up. They're underinvesting in defense. They're not taking their own defense seriously. And we're over assuring them because they're taking so much assurance that they're just not doing their part. How do you think this new Trump team might approach that? And, how did you approach it during your time in
Well, it's a great question, Ray, because I think you have represented in the incoming Trump administration people that will be positioned in both those camps. And, we could name the names. We all know them. Look, I worked with some of them. Look, I think the reality is you can do both. Sometimes it's a matter of what you do behind closed doors and what you do publicly. I personally think it's detrimental to be very public in your criticism of partners and allies, and even resorting to threats about pulling out of an alliance or pulling out forces. I think that's generally a counterproductive approach, and I think it not only harms the alliance relationship, but I think it gives a certain amount of confidence to our adversaries that there are fissures within our alliances that they can exploit. So I think if you look across the Indo-Pacific region, outside of maybe South Korea, Taiwan, Japan working toward a 2%, most countries are falling well below the NATO standard, which they're not bound by, of course, but we should see more investment on the part of our partners, given the growing security challenges in the region. But I think, Ray, part of your question also was, you can calculate contributions in different ways. Japan is working towards 2%, but then again, they contribute to burden sharing through host nation support. They contribute a great deal in soft power. If you look in the region, the most popular country in the world, in the Indo-Pacific, is Japan. And that's been consistent in polling outside of South Korea and China. Japan is widely admired and supported and very consistent as a development assistance partner, et cetera. So there are ways to calculate contributions that go beyond just what you're spending as a percentage of GDP. And I personally am supportive of that more comprehensive look at how countries are contributing and enabling us to be a strong security presence in the region. I would prefer to avoid the public threats and condemnations for shortcomings.
One of the most significant expansion of our alliances over the past 4 years was the Australia-U.K U.S. Agreement, AUKUS. The first pillar of which is for Australia to acquire U.S. Virginia-class nuclear submarines. There's been some concern in the U.S. that we simply can't make them fast enough to supply the U.S. Navy's needs and Australia. So how do you think the Trump administration might approach this issue?
Well, I hope they spend time right away with Senator Wicker and they look at this problem because it's not an insignificant issue that our own ability to supply these world-class platforms to our own fleet could be disrupted by this partnership. You know, I tend to be in the camp, and probably you are, Jim, too. If Australia gets a submarine, that's a value add to us. It's almost indistinguishable from a U.S. platform in the sense that we are the closest allies in the world and we share interests. But I understand what the concerns are, what's been raised in the Senate, and I would call this a good problem to have. I mean, I'm hard-pressed to think of another time when members of Congress would say, whoa, we don't want your business. We don't want more shipbuilding. We don't want more submarine building. So given the timelines involved here, I think there's ample opportunity to ramp up our shipbuilding with the support of Australia. They're paying for these submarines after all, to develop the skilled labor that's necessary, to develop the shipyards. And in some cases, you know, we will rely on the support of others. Korea and Japan are interested in shipbuilding capacity in the United States. We're seeing direct investment in those areas. The cumulative effect of all of that should be to give us enough time to build up a workforce, build up the capacity to meet not only our own goals, but to meet the AUKUS goals.
Randy, let's turning our attention to adversaries, specifically, of course, the pacing threat, China. And of course, you chairman of the board of the 2049 Institute, obviously something that concerns you quite a bit. We have seen a rapidly growing aggression, open aggression coming out of China, particularly in what we often refer to as gray zone warfare. All these activities short of war but are nonetheless extremely aggressive. Most recently, of course, we've had these cable cutting incidents that China has been involved in. We have obviously the South China Sea and activities around Taiwan. What do you make? Is this just a matter of China's increasing confidence in its own capabilities? And why is China suddenly seem to be just amping up the aggression?
Well, part of it is they have the capability to do it, which, that's the result of about 3 decades of tremendous investment in their capabilities across the forces, not only the Gray Hole naval forces, but the Coast Guard and the Maritime Militia. If you look from about 1996 on, the Chinese have consistently increased their annual defense spending in double digits every year, but maybe 1 or 2. And that's the official budgets. We all suspect that they're actually spending more. So at some point, that comes to a certain level of capability where you just have more tools to apply to the problem set. I think that combined with Xi Jinping and his willingness to accept a lot more friction and take on risk is a big part of the equation. I think also, of course, the Chinese have to see pushback if they're not being challenged on this. And I know it's hard, and that brings risk to us. But I think if you look at a situation like what's happening in the South China Sea around Second Thomas Shoal and the Philippine attempts to resupply the Sierra Madre there, I think we need to be more robust in our presence in escorting some of these operations. I think the Chinese need to understand that they will fail to literally push the Philippines off this low tide elevation point. The Chinese are going to be responsive if they see the pushback, I believe. I think that's the historical record. So we need to be working with our partners and allies to make sure that that's part of the regional dynamic that they see, observe, and feel every day.
A big question about this is something we discussed with some other guests, including Defense Department nominee Albert Colby, who feels, yes, China is a pacing threat. We need to throw all our resources to push back. We don't have enough to have basically a two-front approach, Ukraine and China. Taiwan, of course, is saying Ukraine success impacts us directly. How do you think this debate will come out?
I don't know how it'll come out because I think there are voices in the Trump administration that's coming into power on January 20th that represent both those points of view. I consider Bridge Colby a friend, and I've worked with him, traveled with him recently to Taiwan. I happen to strongly disagree with him on this point, and I think the conflicts are interrelated. I believe the best way to deter Xi Jinping is to make sure Putin doesn't succeed in Ukraine. But Bridge raises a good point that we are under-resourced for a potential conflict in the Pacific. I would argue we were in that position before Ukraine, that we've always, given the tyranny of time and distance and the massive area of responsibility that our forces have to provide security and presence for, in an actual conflict in the Pacific, we're badly under-resourced. So yes, more on shipbuilding, but really the posture, the supply, the logistics, the maintenance, all of that is key, requires more investment. Maybe some of that is diverted from other theaters. Maybe it's just more investment and wise investment from our Congress, supported by the Combatant Command and the Department of Defense. But it has to happen if we're going to have credible deterrence. At some point, logistics and maintenance become deterrence because the Chinese understand these gaps. I just don't want anyone to think, it's so fungible. We abandon Ukraine and all of a sudden we're going to be better off in the Indo-Pacific. I just don't believe that to be the case. I agree with the observers in Taiwan who make the case for their own security. So I hope those that agree with this point of view that I'm articulating have a strong voice and are represented well in the incoming administration.
Well, that I think brings us. So we interviewed Bridge, as you may know, back in May, and we had this conversation about what is, when you think about, resources, there's two different ways that you may have to, as you've already outlined, deal with that. One is by diverting them, and two is by having more of them. And one of Bridge's points was that, there's just not the appetite among the American people to devote more of the budget toward defense. You live and work in Washington and move among those circles. Is there potentially an appetite to start really investing in defense, to build the defense industrial base, to actually increase the defense budget?
Yeah, I guess I would start out by saying a lot of this is actually pretty inexpensive when you talk about pouring concrete, when you talk about, and I'm speaking in relative terms, working at an agency that had an $800 billion budget. Some of this is hardly even a rounding error, right? But what we need to do in the Pacific with respect to posture initiatives, some of that is really just pouring concrete for diversionary airfields or sheltering aircraft from ballistic and cruise missile threats. The maintenance and forward deployment of fuel and munitions, relatively inexpensive. Now, when you get into shipbuilding and some of the exquisite munitions, obviously it's more expensive. So I think that it can be done. I think the will can be there. If you follow the discussions in Congress and you follow the process of the Select Committee on China, you look at the NDAAs of the past several years, they want to be strong in the Pacific. And so I think a smart and fiscally responsible approach to strengthening our position in the Pacific is possible.
A lot of this comes down to, as we've been discussing, our defense industrial base. And it's been discussed for ages. I'm sure while you were at the Pentagon, it was discussed as well. And the fact we keep going for these long-term, over-budget, exquisite munitions, which Ukraine is demonstrating may not be the way to go. So is it possible with that huge bureaucracy to change the mindset, to procure more from our partners, to build up their own industrial bases, even while focusing more in our own nation on things that are maybe more bang for the buck.
It is, and I think that is a necessary direction to go. I would say that this administration has attempted to do that. The current administration, the Biden administration, has attempted to do that, and there's some notable arrangements that have been put in place, at least on paper, with some of our partners and allies. But I do think industry needs to be brought along a little more, and industry will respond to the incentive structures that they're given. And when you create an agreement with an ally at the sort of political diplomatic level, and you turn it over to industry and say, now act, they still want the business case. They still want to understand what this is going to mean for their bottom line. So I think there is an opportunity to do that, but we need to bring industry into the conversation on the front end and then figure out the pathways that make commercial business sense for industry to cooperate. There probably are complementary capabilities. There's division of labor. There's opportunities for co-development and co-production. That's all in the realm of the possible. But I think at this point, we're looking at it as sort of a political diplomatic challenge and not doing well enough in terms of engaging industry and bringing them into the conversation.
All right, Randy Schriver, Chairman of the Board of the Project 2049 Institute. I'm going to ask you a question about Taiwan. So what, we've had a number of different conversations about what China's theory of victory is. What did they actually want to do? There's, one sort of set of assumptions that says there could be a cross-strait invasion, and they're planning for that. Second, they are, thinking about a quarantine of the island or some kind of a blockade. Or third, that they're just going to intensify these gray zone operations until they sort of coerce Taiwan into making a deal. How do you look at this problem? Do you see all of those as possibilities? Do you see other possibilities? What does China think it's going to do?
Yeah, and I think implied in your question, those aren't mutually exclusive. You can prepare for an invasion, which I believe they are, but day to day, your operational directives are to apply pressure, coerce, etc. Look, I think the Chinese want to win without fighting, and I think a win for them is some sort of political capitulation. And they, in one sense, the last election was bad for them. Lai Ching-te's victory is the third DPP electoral victory in a row. But in other ways, the KMT has the most seats in the legislative yuan. Lai Ching-te did not get over 50% of the popular vote. He's popular now by Taiwanese historical standards. But the Chinese are not completely in despair about the political environment in Taiwan and their ability to find allies and advocates for a more, let's say, peaceful and different kind of approach with China. So I don't think they've given up. I think the problem is they've convinced themselves they have to prevent independence, and they've sort of prioritized that above promoting reconciliation and what they call reunification. And the irony, of course, is that the tools of preventing independence are the coercive tools, the military tools, and those are precisely the things that destroy hearts and minds, which puts their actual objective further and further away. And I think some folks are a little bit deceived by the polling in Taiwan. You'll hear people say 85, 90% of Taiwanese support the status quo. Well, that's true depending on how the question's asked. If you say status quo now, what do you want in your future? Those numbers change dramatically. People say status quo now, independence in their future, over half the population. The people saying status quo now, unification later, single digits, and those numbers are moving in the wrong direction with respect to Beijing's point of view. So there is an independence movement in Taiwan. They just don't want to be attacked, and the Chinese understand this. So the problem is really the Chinese are driving further and further into a cul-de-sac where they might at some point feel that they have to use force. Do they have patience indefinitely? Can they put this off beyond 2049? Xi Jinping has talked about great national rejuvenization by 2049. That part is unclear. So I think their preference is to win without fighting. Their preference is through this combination of gray zone tactics and coercion and pressure, get some sort of political capitulation. But the mood in Taiwan is leading in the opposite direction of that, and has been for several administrations in a row.
So there's been some concern that President Trump will try and strike some sort of grand bargain with PRC related to Taiwan or whatever. Did you see any evidence, maybe when Trump was dealing with North Korea, that he is interested in sort of a grand bargain of that nature?
Yes, but I would add that he has sort of competing impulses that can contradict one another. He wants the big deal and the splashy, rollout of the grand agreement, grand bargain, but he doesn't want a bad deal. And I was part of the USG delegation in both Singapore, where we signed an agreement, where President Trump signed an agreement with Kim Jong-un, and again in Hanoi, where he didn't, where he walked away. And so he proved he doesn't want any deal. He wants what he conceives as a good deal. Now, people could be in disagreement over what constitutes a good deal. But, he doesn't want a bad deal. He doesn't want to look like he was taken advantage of. He doesn't want to be perceived as a loser. So I would apply that across the board. I don't think he's going to want to deal with Russia, where he's going to be, sort of identified as the man who lost Ukraine. I don't think he's going to want to deal with China, that would tag him as the person who lost Taiwan. I do think, Jim, your question, it does strike at one of his impulses, and something he will, I think, pursue. But I don't think it's the whole story.
When we think of some of the things that have happened since the first Trump administration, one of the things that's happened recently within the last year is the progression of these two sort of trilaterals that have happened. One, U.S., Japan, South Korea. Two, U.S., Japan, the Philippines. Do these models have a future in a second Trump administration? And particularly, of course, we know that the political unrest in South Korea leaves that kind of very much in doubt, since one of the forces that's involved is not as favorable toward that than the now impeached president is or has been. How do you look, and are these a good idea? How do you see these two trilaterals in a future security environment?
I think they are a good idea. I really applaud the Biden administration and the work that they did on both of those trilaterals. I think it's important to add, though, that particularly the Japan-Korea U.S. trilateral didn't begin with the Biden administration. And in fact, we held trilateral meetings all the way to the cabinet level. In fact, I think every one of these multilateral gatherings that I participated in, whether that be Shangri-La Dialogue or the ASEAN Defense Minister Meeting Plus, our Secretary of Defense took time to have a trilateral with his counterparts from Japan and Korea. At my level, at Assistant Secretary, we routinely had trilateral meetings. So that tells me that it would continue in some form in the Trump administration 2.0. I don't know that you get the same level of personal involvement and investment from the president himself. But I think it will continue because it's in our interest. We're being compelled to cooperate in this manner because of the actions of China and North Korea. And there are some real practical and to get into the military issues a little bit, operational advantages to having this trilateral cooperation that I think are so evident that this is not something we walk away from without a cost.
In the first Trump administration, there was a considerable frustration with our friends from the ASEAN countries about them refusing to choose sides, that neutrality is effectively choosing China. The Biden administration has tamped down the frustrations while still having them. How do you think this Trump administration might approach this issue? Will they apply even more pressure? Will they stand off? How will this go?
I think this is a case where the hand that's dealt Trump 2.0 is a little different than 1.0. So I don't see a complete return to the previous approach. And what I mean by that is we now have a much better partner in the Philippines with President Marcos. We have somebody who's more security-minded in Indonesia and Prabowo. We even have a change of leadership in Singapore, which doesn't happen very often. So I think it's a different cast that will probably work with us more closely on the security issues. I think that quality of not wanting to choose, that's always going to be part of the public posture. What I found is they don't want to choose. They don't want to choose in public. They don't want to be put into a position where they have to say things that make explicit their alignment with us. In private, behind closed doors, I think almost across the board, and I visited every ASEAN country with the exception of Burma in the last, and Laos, excuse me. And behind closed doors, there's shared concern about China's increasing provocations and their ambitions that affect them very directly in some cases where there's disputed territory, and in some cases everybody's sort of affected indirectly by a more tense security environment and the possibility of one of these flashpoints escalating into a conflict. And look, I think although, again, different style and rhetoric from the top, we were able to do a lot of, I think, very important things in ASEAN and in Southeast Asia. Take Indonesia, we got Kopassus off the blacklist and were able to resume exercising with their special forces. We were able to restore in Thailand a lot of the security assistance to include the professional military education exchanges and have that funded. Even in the Philippines, where we had a pretty tough go of it with President Duterte, the cooperation particularly on counterterrorism and the campaign in Marawi City really became an enabler for us to do some important things that maybe were under the radar. For example, really some important developments in Subic Bay and the combination of a public-private approach to securing an important facility there that the South Koreans for naval ship repair and maintenance and possibly even building. So, I think in the tough environment that we were sometimes finding ourselves in 1.0, we were able to do some I think, productive things. I think it'll be better this time. And I think there will be people in the system that will be able to nurture those relationships in the right ways.
Well, so you mentioned the Philippines, and certainly one leader who has chosen sides is President Marcos. Now, he, of course, is term limited to a single term that expires when 2028, about the same time as our next election. And waiting in the wings is a vice president whose name is also Duterte. And so there's a lot of interest and concern as to whether or not the Philippines' bet on the United States is paying off. And you can look at it in certain ways and say, look, and they've actually lost ground in the West Philippine Sea. They no longer have really hardly any access to Scarborough Shoal, and Sabina Shoal seems to be taken from them. And so is this bet paying off? And so on the other side of the ledger is, well, they're now getting a lot of extra assistance from the United States. They're getting additional funds. They're getting additional assurances. They're getting these joint patrols. Is this enough to really sort of convince Filipinos and others around the region that betting on the United States is a good bet, or does more need to be done?
Well, I think this process of assurance and reassurance is one that will need to be renewed, and this has been a challenge for the Trump administration because of some of the rhetoric, but also some of the policies, as Jim mentioned, the tariff policies. So I think it needs to be renewed, and it needs to be supported by actions. I think if you look at what's happened from really the Obama administration to the present with the U.S.-Philippine relationship, the overall arc has been a positive trajectory. Even during those dark days of the Duterte administration, as I mentioned, important cooperation in counterterrorism, important cooperation to enable posture opportunities for us. The ECTA sites. We continued to work on those in the Trump administration, although there were challenges in getting those sites completed. We've now expanded that. We've expanded our exercises. The exercises now have components of leave behinds when it comes to certain capabilities we want forward deployed. So I'm pretty optimistic. And, if there's political change in the Philippines, one thing I think we can count on is the overwhelming popular support of the alliance in the Philippines. I think we poll as a country and as an alliance in the mid 80s, maybe the high 80s. The institutional ties, when we had our issues with President Duterte, I don't think we had a better relationship in the region when it came to defense secretaries, when it came to Jim Mattis and Delfin Lorenzano. And those institutional relationships do matter a lot, particularly when you find yourself in a position with political difficulties at the top. And again, I think that the Chinese, we're going to get help from the Chinese, if you will. The Filipinos don't want to sacrifice what they regard as sovereign territory. They don't want to live in an environment of intense coercion and pressure. And so I think the demand signal will continue to be there. And I draw a little bit of a distinction here with South Korea. They tend to sort of alternate between progressives and conservatives. And there is, in many cases, some real policy implications to that. I think with the Philippines, the Duterte view is really an aberration and way out of step with the Filipino population. So even a return of the family, if it's Sara Duterte, I'm pretty confident we'd be able to continue the right kind of momentum in the security and military relationship.
You mentioned that you expect there'll be people in the Trump 2.0 administration who will manage the relationships in the Indo-Pacific. But we're not going to have people like Secretary Mattis or yourself at the Pentagon or Matt Pottinger at MSC, people who really understood the region. Are you concerned that if he doesn't name the right people, we could have people who just don't have the experience or understanding of the cultural issues and historical background to manage all this?
Well, people matter. People are policy, and some have said, I think that might be a Reagan quote, it's important. But I think we're already seeing some good selections. Secretary of State Rubio designate, National Security designate, Mike Waltz. Those are people with strong instincts for alliance relationships, even if they're not particularly Asianists. Rubio has plenty of experience. He was chair of the the Congressional Executive Commission on China for a period. So I think we'll have people at various levels to include at the cabinet level that will take an interest in this. I'm hearing rumors about other people going into particular positions, and I don't want to share those in public. It wouldn't be appropriate. But
please do on this podcast, right? We promise we'll go out tomorrow.
As a general matter, I'm encouraged that we will get people who do understand the alliance relationships, will invest in them, and generally will be positive forces when it comes to alliance building. And, I know it's not in fashion to talk about the permanent bureaucracy and at risk of praising the deep state. I actually think in periods of transition, our bureaucrats are incredibly important. Our foreign service, our civil service at the Pentagon, our uniformed military. And, these are people that not only are active in the relationship building themselves, they will be the people who help train the incoming political appointees and inform them of these important relationships and what needs to be done. It's up to the political appointees if they want to follow through. But I think, in the meantime, we're really blessed to have tremendous foreign service and civil service and uniformed military. I just saw, for example, the decision to send Joe Yoon to South Korea to be the interim ambassador or chargé. What a terrific decision that was, and putting that important portfolio in the hands of somebody so skilled and talented. So I think we'll see a number of moves like that up until the transition and through the transition. to make sure that these alliance relationships are well cared for and the investments are sustained.
Well, so the headline here is Schriver praises the deep state. We had
That's great.
well, that's right. So we had Malcolm Turnbull, a former Prime Minister of Australia, on not long ago, and he called us swamp creatures.
It's hard for me to deny after moving here 32 years ago that I'm not one of them. So,
well, so speaking of what you're up to, and we're going to kind of get you out of here on this. Okay, so chairman of the board of the 2049 Project 2049 Institute. Tell us a little bit about what that is and what you do there, and also the vice chair of the U.S. China Economic and Security Review Commission. What is that, and what did they do?
Well, I appreciate the opportunity to talk about both, and I will make some news here. I'm going to give you a little bit of an announcement in a moment. But Project 2049, I founded with another gentleman, Mark Stokes, in 2008. And we were betting on the proposition that there would be interest in deep study and analysis of what we saw in 2008 as the rising China challenge. And so we're a think tank, nonprofit, nonpartisan, and we do what other think tanks do in terms of producing reports, holding events, receiving and sending delegations, etc. But we've always said we want to do the deep dive work that a lot of think tanks don't do. They'll stay at the 30,000 foot elevation and talk about high policy, but we'll do very detailed reports on how the PLA is structured to conduct cyber warfare. We'll do the report on the emerging anti-ship ballistic missile program, which, by the way, when Mark Stokes wrote the seminal piece, there were people that were saying, not possible, the Chinese can't do this. So we've taken the approach that there is a market for this deep dive research and analysis. Our secret sauce is often that we have excellent Chinese linguists who can do the open source research in Chinese language materials. And I think, almost 20 years later, that bet has paid off, and we have a pretty good constituency for our product line who really understand that you need to go to these depths. You need this kind of analytical power to really understand the challenges emerging from China. On the commission, so the U.S. China Security Economic Review Commission was created around the time of China's entry into WTO, and in particular the granting of permanent normal trade relations. People in this discussion will recall we used to have an annual debate on most favored nation status for China. And that was a debate that allowed people to air a variety of concerns, whether that be human rights, religious freedom, but also security concerns. And when we lost the annual MFN debate, we lost that sort of platform for those discussions. So Congress created this commission to continue to study China and have a platform for investigating those issues, but also making them public. So we're a commission set up by Congress. We have 12 commissioners. Or I should say we have 12 spaces for commissioners. We have a couple gaps right now because people chose not to seek reappointment. But we're 6 Republicans, 6 Democrats. We come up with a bipartisan annual report every year, including this past year where we produced a report with 32 different recommendations for Congress. And we try to do similar deep dive work, but we also try to look around corners. And we try to say, Congress might be working on outbound investment issues right now. Are they looking sufficiently at AI and AGI, for example? Our number one recommendation this year related to artificial intelligence. So we try to do the kind of longer term look around the corner issues to drive the Congress in what we think are the right directions with respect to China policy. And over the stretch of that period, 2001 to the present, we have a pretty good track record of Congress taking up our recommendations in actual legislation. Maybe not the year we put it out in an annual report, but oftentimes in the subsequent years, they'll see us as a resource and they'll pull one of those recommendations and put it into legislation. And like I said, we're very happy with the track record and being a resource for that.
And just so I'm clear on your announcement,
sorry, I failed to agree that. I got everybody excited. So Project 2049 being founded in 2008, we were pretty niche. We looked at China military and cross-strait issues. We've really expanded our work and our products. We do things more broadly in the Indo-Pacific. We have relationships with the governments of Japan, with South Korea, with Australia. We've gotten grants from the government of Australia. So we've decided to rebrand and relaunch this spring as the Institute for Indo-Pacific Security, IPS. We will keep the Project 2049 brand as a directorate. So the work we do on China studies, China-Taiwan issues will be under the 2049 directorate. But the mothership, the think tank, will be relaunched as the Institute for Indo-Pacific Security. That's the first time I've said it publicly. So you guys have the
honor, the scoop. Yeah. I thought maybe you were announcing for, say, 2028 or something. All right. And finally, where can we follow your work and what you're up to?
Yeah, thanks. Project 2049's website, which will be relaunched. I can't give you the domain for that because I'm not sure I know it, but we have it. But in the meantime, project2049.net is our website, and the commission similarly has a website, uscc.gov, I believe, and would really commend the work of both and hope they're useful resources for you guys and people listening.
All right. Well, we will certainly be watching since we are an Indo-Pacific podcast. We will be very interested in what the Institute for Indo-Pacific Security has to say. And Randy Schriver, we do thank you for joining us.
Appreciate it, Ray and Jed.
And Jim, just a reminder that our tremendous sponsor is Bauer Group Asia. Bauer Group Asia is a strategic advisory firm that specializes in the Indo-Pacific. BGA applies unmatched expertise and experience to help clients navigate the world's most complex and dynamic markets. And I'm sure that President Marcos appreciates it as well, Jim Caruso. So what did you think of Randy Schriver?
Well, we dealt with Randy when we were public servants, and we always found him, as he was today, very knowledgeable, straight shooter, good to work with. I thought it was a really interesting interview. He covered a lot of territory, but I'm going to ask you to try and summarize what do you think his outlook is for the Trump administration vis-a-vis the region?
Well, I mean, I think he is cautiously optimistic, right? So he has seen the first movie, if you will. He knows that it's we can tend to over focus, and we did during the first Trump administration. I mean, a lot of people did. So did our partners and allies. So did others, on a particular appointment, a particular statement, a particular tweet. All of those things, and yet actually, most things actually do sort of get churned through the normal processes or something approaching the normal processes, and what comes out the other end does not necessarily meet everyone's highest hopes or worst fears. It's usually some collaboration, and actually there were several very good things that did come out of that first Trump administration for a lot of the Indo-Pacific, for very particularly for several of our partners and allies. And so I think that since he's not obviously looking at being part of this particular administration that we know of, but and we did certainly give him every opportunity to make news on that front. But I think that he seems cautiously optimistic to me.
And what I took away was he is hopeful that the individuals that will be appointed below the secretary level will have an understanding and appreciation for the region and help not only affect policy, but implement the policy in a best possible way.
Yeah. And certainly there are going to be some bumps in the road. There are in every administration, and they certainly were in the first Trump administration. And a lot of those come out of, certain pronouncements that come out that had not been fully sort of gone through the ringer. They haven't gone through all of the, somebody says something, including the president, that takes everybody by surprise and alarm, and you have to sort of figure out, okay, what does it mean? And oftentimes it actually doesn't actually mean very much. It's just somebody's talking, it's just the president talking. And that's one of the hard things for when you have the leaders who've seen it and understand it, then they can kind of get their heads around it and they don't over worry about it. But then you'll have those who, first of all, of course, it's played on all their news programs, right? And so everybody wants to know what that means.
All I'll say is that if Greenland is so important for U.S. security that we need to take it over, how do you think Xi's looking at Taiwan with that metric?
Well, so as far as I know, Xi Jinping hasn't said that he will buy Taiwan. Yeah.
Maybe we're just getting an idea.
Well, it's okay. You know, I'm pretty sure that our two new senators from Canada will have a say in how that goes down. So
they're only giving them 2. That's pretty
chintzy. They're one state, right? They're the 51st. We're not making news here, Canada. Don't worry.
All right, we got to stop this. Tell me a story that's uplifting and humorous.
Okay, I've got lots of those. Well, since we had Randy Schriver on today, I will tell you about my very first trip back to the United States with the Minister of Defense from Australia, Maurice Payne, to go and visit Secretary Mattis at the Pentagon. And this was a very long and grueling trip, in part because Australia's rules for government officials traveling via air are different from our rules. Our rules are either you fly coach or you have your own plane. There's nothing in between, right? So, and you've experienced this yourself. So you're looking forward to this long trans-Pacific flight, and when you're accompanying a delegation, they all turn left and go into business class, and you turn right and sit behind 2 crying babies in coach, and don't sleep all day, all trip, which can be 15 hours long. And so this was the experience. And so as I took this trip, I had to get on the plane, lose track of them as they're all up in business class, sleeping and drinking champagne. I'm, getting through this trip, and then we get off at, say, Hawaii is our first stop on the way, and then I try to catch up with them, and then we'll have these intermediate stops as we go, and I would try to sort of be their little buddy as they go into these exclusive lounges and things that they get to go into, and I'm like, yeah, I'm with them, and so I chased them all through this trip. I mean, my experiences with this, it wasn't this particular trip, but I remember one time I was standing next to an Australian counterpart and standing at the baggage claim. And he says, my experience in business class on this trip just wasn't up to par. I didn't find the service to be what I'm used to. And I'm looking at him and I'm just, did they teach you diplomacy in diplomat school?
He knew what he was saying to you.
So anyway, finally we get to DC. We go to meet with Secretary Mattis, and we walk in. And so first of all, the Americans all get there, and so we are standing in a line. And right at the front of the line, of course, is Randy Schriver. And as Mattis walks in, the first person, he's going to shake hands with everybody in the line, and then reposition at the front of the line. So he gets to, of course, he knows Randy Schriver, and he knows his deputy Joe Felter, and he knows all the other people in the line. And then he gets to the defense attaché, whom he's never met in his life. And I lean forward and I say, I'm standing there in my blue uniform with my aiguillette hanging off my shoulder. And I say, hi, sir, I'm Ray Powell. I'm the defense attaché. And he leans into me and he looks me straight in the eye and he says, I know. And that was the entire conversation. So words to live by, words I've never forgotten. I know exactly what Jim Mattis said to me the first time we met. But the Aussies, they loved Jim Mattis. They just, first of all, they found him, compelling, incredible. He had obviously the gravitas that went with his reputation and with being, retired 4-star and all of those things. But also he was just really, really good with allies and partners. He would deal directly with what they were interested in. He was very good at sort of figuring out what they needed to know and getting straight to that.
Well, when we heard he was coming in, we used widely with the media in Australia his quote, which was, I'd be willing to storm the gates of hell if I had an Australian battalion on my flank.
Yeah, that definitely sounds like a Mattis quote. And by the way, we'll save this for later, but we'll talk about sometime when we had an Osman and we conspired on a Jim Mattis email that was highly effective. But we'll save that. We'll tease that out for a future podcast. All right, Jim, this has been a great episode. I'm really happy Randy decided to join us. Our producer, of course, is Ian Ellis Jones. He puts up with all of our nonsense and shenanigans. He does those great military and geopolitical graphics, of which I have asked him to do one specifically for me this week. Thank you, Ian. I'm just putting extra pressure on you. But you can follow him on X at Ian Ellis Jones. That's what most people do because that's where a lot of those great graphics. And by the way, those things get so much attention. I am so jealous of his X following. If you've enjoyed this episode on audio, you can see us on video, youtube.com at IP Podcast. Go ahead and let us make us go viral on this one. Why not? You can also watch us on X at Indo-Pacific Podcast. Follow us on, of course, all the podcast streaming services, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, etc. And we have a LinkedIn page, which is actually where a lot more people, we've gone up over 1,000 followers on LinkedIn, which is great because a lot of those are some really, I've actually learned that there are some really interesting people out there following us on LinkedIn. And you can email us with your suggestions. We've already looked at a few and taken a couple, and we are working on some of the guests that some have been suggested to us. Indo-Pacific Podcast@gmail.com. Finally, don't forget to follow and keep track of what our sponsor is doing, BauerGroupAsia.com. And for Jim and Ian, I'm Ray. Thank you for joining us for this episode of Why Should We Care About the Indo-Pacific?